Hey, Cypher here. Today I've got a special episode of Wars You've Never Heard of and Engaging Etymology. I'm going to show you how the mundane word Boondocks is derived from one of America's longest and most brutal wars. A war that seems to have been forgotten by most, and misrepresented by so many of the people who mention it otherwise. It is the Philippine Insurrection, also known as the Moro War and the Philippine-American Wars. Seriously, the word Boondocks comes from a war that raged from 1899 to 1913, a full 14 years. Now that it is 2016, Afghanistan has only now surpassed the length of this war, and is certainly more docile than what happened in the Philippines over a century ago. So let's dig into how this brutal war cemented the word Boondocks into our language. During the Spanish-American War, the U.S. sought to capture Manila from the Spanish. There had been a strong independence movement in the Philippines prior to the war in 1896, and the U.S. accidentally helped to create the First Philippine Republic. The U.S. supported revolutionaries who were led by Emilio Aguinaldo in order to gain power over the island from the Spanish. But the U.S. did not support actual independence. When the treaty between Spain and the U.S. was signed, all the Philippines were formally annexed by the U.S. The newly formed republic that had established itself during the war refused to give into American control, and so war began in 1899, with Filipinos trying to keep their independence while the U.S. attempted to assert power over its newly acquired territory. There was a large contingent of people who vehemently protested the taking of the Philippines in America. From famous figures like Andrew Carnegie to everyday people who decided to protest in the streets, it was a hotly contested subject. One could draw many parallels to the Vietnam War of 1964 to 1973, except for this war was longer and more brutal. The Philippine War turned nasty quickly. The first years of the insurrection were the worst. As soon as Aguinaldo declared war against the U.S. on February 4, 1899, fighting began immediately. A day later, the largest battle happened in Manila as the U.S. took the city by force. The war sank into jungle warfare. Each campaign became reliant on increasing guerrilla tactics. It turned nasty, with campaigns to rout out suspected leaders of the insurrection, prison camps, torture, gruesome executions, and mass killings on the scale which really ought to be called genocide. The atrocities were compounded on both sides, but with the US being the more powerful contender, they killed many more civilians than the other side. On numerous occasions, massacres happened where orders were given to simply kill anything that moved within a particular region. One general infamously ordered the killing of any boy who was old enough to carry a gun for the entire island of Samar, barring a particular enclave. Americans even resorted to the old imperial Spanish technique called the water cure, where they would funnel water down a person's throat until they either confessed or drowned. And the massacres, by the way, were just too numerous to even count. Eventually, Aguinaldo was captured in March of 1901. He appealed to the Filipinos to end the insurrection, but it was symbolic and certainly not the end. William Taft, who would later become president, came in as a governor a few months later, but held very little power in the islands. Instead, a terribly effective policy was instituted later that year. People on entire islands were rounded up into concentration camps, and if they refused, they were held to be in insurrection and often killed. By concentrating the population in a particular place, the U.S. Army could rout out any insurrectionaries. As part of this, the U.S. also burned crops and killed livestock, leading to massive famine that killed hundreds of thousands of Filipinos. And this is where the word Boondocks comes in. It means mountain in Tagalog, but Americans came to use it in reference to the area outside of the concentration camps. Seriously, the word Boondocks originally entered the English language in relationship to very real and almost genocidal American concentration camps. The worst thing is, this policy of labeling the Boondocks outside of concentration camps as insurrectionary was entirely effective. It broke the insurrection. Most islands were officially pacified in 1902. And that's where many historians end. But they failed to see how the war actually continued. Declaring victory and achieving it are two very different things. Yes, the worst of the fighting was over, but an even more radicalized group began to take over the insurrection. These were the Moroes, and they were a fearsome group. They became known for attacking soldiers with their bolo knives and killing many before being felled in a hail of gunfire. It is like how many people imagined Viking berserkers, if imagination on that subject were actually to hold up to reality, but that's not the subject here. But seriously, the army even adopted the M1911 pistol specifically to kill Moros more easily. By the way, they were ethnically Muslim mostly. The insurrection continued well into 1913, with the US military and Filipino constabulary continually using concentration camps, raiding, and patrols to combat Moros. In a final climactic battle, after years of pushing the Moros into smaller and smaller regions, the last of them were fought in the Battle of Bud Bagsak, ending the war for good. Because of the length of this war and the horrid conditions of its victory, the American public was soured on the idea of imperialism. Where in 1898 many had rallied around annexing territory, after years of contemptible warfare, most were done with the whole idea. It is because of the Philippines insurrection that the US chose not to pursue more expansion, and did not annex any territory because of World War I. We were done with it. And that's pretty much where American expansionism ended, was in this brutal war. Because of the terrible news arriving from the Philippines of further and further atrocities, Americans adopted some of the lingo, including the word boondocks. It's truly fearful that such a mundane word can carry tinges of genocide and atrocity in its etymology. Makes you wonder what else lays hidden in our language. Well, actually I have a playlist for that. Or maybe you want to know more about American Small Wars. I've also created a playlist for that. Check those out if you would like, and don't forget to like and subscribe.